All right, gentlemen, now that we have covered the three branches of our government, we are going to look at the interplay of those three branches a little more completely. We are going to look at the bureaucracy. So this kind of is a catch-all term for the kind of inner workings of American government. You know, it's not necessarily branches. These are the institutions, the organizations, you know, the regulatory bodies, things of that nature, which are created maybe by the executive branch, maybe by the Congress, who knows? It's a tangled web. Now, bureaucracy has got a real bad name, right? It's one of those words people are not very fond of. There is a reputation or a stigma attached with bureaucracy, especially when it involves government. It implies inefficiency. It implies red tape, right? Things like that. Um, if you want a technical definition, though, the word bureaucracy means a large, complex organization composed of appointed officials. Now, within a political context, okay, you have to understand that there is something about bureaucracy that makes it almost inevitably unpopular at some times. There are other ways where it's helpful or useful, beneficial, depending upon who you're speaking to or speaking about. But by and large, most people complain about bureaucracy because of the very size and complexity of it, right? And people just don't like the fact that it's this big tangled web and it seems like there's all these layers and all these levels and all these forms and all this red tape, right? And why can't we just get this done? And why do we have to do all this, right? Because people like, and we've talked about this, they like definitive action, right? They like decisive, quick action. And bureaucracy is anything but quick and decisive. Um, it's very structured and regimented, and you've got a lot of hoops to jump through, and that makes it unpopular because that's not what people want. Most people don't wake up in the morning and say, "Boy, I can't wait to fill out a lot of forms." They want things done. You know, now, your book gave some examples of back in the day versus what it is today. Obviously, the bureaucracy has changed dramatically over the history, the scope of American history. And even in the last, generation or two, it continues to grow and evolve very much so since, the the Great Depression, New Deal, Second World War. So let's start to look at this evolutionary process and talk about American bureaucracy. Now, one thing, American bureaucracy, the United States bureaucracy, is distinct. And there are three things, as you can see up here, that make it distinct from what you would find in other countries. For one, political authority is shared. What does that mean? This goes back to the difference between our government and, say, England's government. In England's government, the prime minister has his cabinet, and they basically appoint people and they issue orders, and those orders trickle down to underlings who carry them out, who issue them to their subordinates. It's a very simple top-down structure, a pyramid organization. If you remember us discussing how presidents sometimes organize their White House, it's very easy to track the flow of authority. Not the case here in America. Here in America, um, you know, president and Congress have authority to some degree. And so what you find in America is you have bureaucracies who have to answer to two masters at the same time, sometimes more than two. Because remember, Congress is not one institution. It's actually two institutions. So you have some agencies, some bodies, right? They're having to answer things from the executive branch. They're having to answer from their House committee. They're having to deal with the fact that there's also a Senate committee that oversees them. They're getting pulled in three different directions. And all three of them have legitimate legal authority. Right? They're not overstepping their bounds. And again, that comes back to America's, um, federalism too, as we're about to see. It becomes very difficult for American bureaucracy to have any sort of streamlined efficiency because there are so many chefs in the kitchen, if you will. Um, second issue is, as I just pointed out, most of the agencies in the federal government share their role, purpose, mandate with some sort of state and local agency or governmental body. Again, federalism, something that the Europeans don't really have, right? They've got the local government answers to the regional government, which answers to the national government. We've got this system where the local government answers to the state government that sometimes answers to the national government, but it doesn't always answer the national government because there's sometimes the state government has supremacy. Yeah, it's weird. And so what you have is you have federal agencies that are doing things that also local and state agencies are doing. And sometimes they are fighting turf wars and competing for resources and jurisdiction and things of that nature. Um, for example, the Department of Education gives money to local school systems. Um, but the local school systems also have their own school boards and PTAs and things of this nature who will then act independently of the Department of Education. Um, you've got all sorts of programs and spending, right, that comes down from the national level, and then it gets in the hands of these local and regional and state institutions or organizations, and they kind of do with it as they will. In France, that's not the way it works. The French government has programs for education, health, housing, employment, and they are run by the national government. And there might be regional or local offices that handle things at the local or regional level, but they're not working independently. They are just basically carrying out the wishes and the mandates of the central government policy directed from Paris, right? Whereas, no, that's not the way it works here. Kenton County might be doing something different than what Boone County is doing, and different than what Campbell County is doing, or Kentucky might be doing something different with its money than Ohio is doing. There's a lot of diversity in how things are handled at the state and local level compared to what you would see in other countries. And lastly, and this is something that goes back to the character of the American people and our relationship to our government. There is the tradition in America that has created what we like to call an adversarial culture or adversary culture. Um, and basically, the idea of we will fight the government and other groups, right? And we will fight institutions. Um, you know, our government operates with a lot more scrutiny and oversight from the population than in other countries. But again, that goes back to the origins of our country. Um, but in a lot of other countries, like in Western Europe, nobody's telling the government what to do. Nobody's telling the government you can't do that. No one's suing the government. Let's just say that, right? In Sweden, when the Swedish government makes a decision, that's the decision of the Swedish government. Like, that's the end of the discussion, right? If you don't like it, leave Sweden. Meanwhile, here in America, the EPA tries to pass a law and a bunch of companies sue the EPA, right? Or a bunch of interest groups sue the EPA, and there's a court case, and the national government or the agency or whatever has got to defend its policy or its decision. Again, you don't have that as much in other countries. People aren't suing governmental organizations. People aren't suing the government. They're just like, yeah, whatever. Whereas we here in America, we take a much, I don't know exactly what word I want to use besides adversary, but we are less um, deferential to our government. We question it, we argue it, we challenge it far more than they do in other countries. And I will say too, the scope of our bureaucracy differs. In Western European countries, by and large, the government owns and operates large parts of the economy. They have socialism. Okay. For example, the French government operates the railroads. They own the companies that make the automobiles and cigarettes. As your book mentioned, the Italian government controls the nation's oil refineries. In just about every large nation, the government owns the telephone system. The United States is the great exception. Publicly operated enterprises account for 12% of all employment in France, but less than 3% in the United States. The United States government has less direct control over our economy and our services than you would find in a lot of our Western European counterparts, which of course then makes it a very interesting dynamic. Because again, in Europe, they don't have to deal with a lot of arguing because it's real simple. People in Europe want trains. The government is in control of the trains. The government decides what we're doing with the trains. End of story. Whereas we here in America have privately owned rail companies. And then the government tries to basically regulate the privately owned rail companies. Instead of the government owning it, they try to regulate privately owned. And of course, the question is how far should the government be allowed to go, and et cetera, right? So there's a very interesting dynamic, right, for American bureaucracy compared to what you'd find in most European countries. Now, and we will come back to the idea of why we believe that private ownership with regulation is better than the government actually owning and controlling it. We'll get back to that later. Now, one thing that American bureaucracy or American government has gotten more fond of over time is something that we call government by proxy. Okay, um, the voters elect the legislators who make the law, but in this country, the bureaucrats pay people to do the work, right? So we elect, and here you go. So we elect people to go to Congress, and theoretically, they're going to take care of all these things that we need the government to take care of. The people in Congress don't actually take care of it. They give that task to somebody else, somebody we didn't elect, right? Somebody we didn't choose. They simply grant the authority and power that they have to someone else to take care of it. Okay, so they are serving like the government, but they're not the actual government. They're basically working for the government, right? Um, your book mentioned a great example. In the first Gulf War, which took place in 1999 or 1991, excuse me, it started when I was 10 years old. American soldiers outnumbered private contractors 60-1. So for every private contractor, right, every military contractor, whatever terms you might have heard, 60-1. But by 2006, there were nearly as many private contractors as actual American soldiers in Iraq. One company was paid $7.2 billion to get food and supplies to our troops there, right? Instead of the United States Army actually taking care of things in Iraq, the government was like, yeah, we'll give this company a contract to do it. Now, I will go ahead and really quickly point out there's a benefit to this if you're the government. The benefit is 9 times out of 10, they're going to do it better than the government because they can make money. See, the government really can't make money. And it's not because government is stupid or government is bad. Stick with me. If the government were to make a bunch of money, the government is going to have to do one of two things. Immediately use that money to pay off the debt, or they're going to have to lower taxes or something because we're all going to say, wait a minute, you guys made all that money. Why am I paying all these taxes? Right? The government is supposed to operate like a nonprofit organization. I mean, if you think about it, we expect our government to be nonprofit. We don't expect our government to take one extra penny out of us than they need. So if your government were to actually turn a profit, we would be mad at them, right? And so for the government, it's really hard to get people to be motivated to do the job any better, any faster, And that's the other thing. It's the government. They can't really lose. It's like it's the army. If the army does a less than stellar job of doing things in Iraq, they don't lose their jobs, really. It's not like we're going to fire the army. It's not like we're going to say, U.S. Army, you did an awful job over there. We're going to give the next war to someone else. No. But you give a company a contract to provide supplies to the U.S. Army in Iraq, right? And you gave them, let's just say you gave them like a flat contract, right? not one of those cost plus deals or any of that. You just gave them a flat number. Hey, we need you to supply this many troops for this amount of time. Right? Here's how much money we're going to give you. If you think about it, that person is going to do an outstanding job. They're going to try and become as efficient as possible and get the job done to not only A, turn a profit, a maximum profit off of that contract. They're going to want to do a good job so they get another contract from you. They want to keep the business coming. And so government by proxy is actually kind of beneficial for everybody involved. 9 times out of 10, the government's going to get better services than it would have gotten on its own, right? Um, and also, it takes it off the government's plate, right? It's one less thing the government has to worry about. For example, your book mentioned when Hurricane Katrina hit, um, the nation, we have the FEMA, you've probably heard of, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA only has about 2,600 employees, right? That's it. Because FEMA doesn't actually do any disaster relief. What does FEMA do? It's in the name, kids. Federal Emergency Management Agency. They manage the emergency. They don't fix the emergency. FEMA does not drive truckloads of fresh water in. FEMA does not go find temporary well, let me rephrase that. FEMA does not actually make temporary housing for anyone. FEMA does not do anything. FEMA coordinates. FEMA finds resources. FEMA contacts organizations. FEMA contracts with people. FEMA finds help to fix the emergency. It's not like FEMA has a bunch of guys sitting around just waiting for a hurricane so they can drive their equipment out and go fix it, right? That would be a waste. Basically, FEMA is waiting for a disaster, and then they open up their contact list and they start contacting the people that they usually contact to help fix disasters. That's an example of government by proxy. Because is FEMA in charge of, fixing disasters? Yes, they are. But are they actually doing the fixing? No, they're contracting people, right? They're hiring people to do it for them. Now, critics argue you don't really keep track of the money. You don't know how much overspending is taking place necessarily. There's not a whole lot of auditing. There's the idea that the government is handing its power over to these unelected individuals. Basically they're using our money, the taxpayer money, um, in ways that we didn't necessarily approve, etc. Now, as I was saying, first of all, it tends to provide us with better services. Um, it allows for a flexibility, just like I said with FEMA. FEMA can keep a low payroll. They don't need an army of people just waiting for a disaster. You have a small staff of specialists who, when a disaster strikes, know how to get it fixed, who to contact, how to get it fixed. Right? Flexibility. Um, it allows you to rapidly expand government in times of a crisis, like the COVID crisis. Right? You know, I mean, this is forced the government to go in directions in ways it might not have been planning to go about a year ago. But by having this kind of tradition of proxy government, it's easy to contact people, to contract people, to give people duties and responsibilities that they might not have had before and that the government might not have had before. Um, and you know what? This does, in a way, embody some of the federalism we love, right? It's not the big government, controlling everything. I mean, they are in a way, but again, they are contacting people. They're kind of passing the work down. It's being done at a more local or regional level. You know, um, it's taking advantage of the skills of the private sector. It does provide jobs. See, that's the thing too that we're going to talk more about when we talk about the growth of bureaucracy. And I've said this before in this class. The size of the federal government hasn't grown very much since 1960. It really hasn't. The size of the federal government has remained relatively the same. The size of state and local government has exploded, right? When we complain about the growth of government, we should be complaining about the growth of local and state government, not federal government. Federal government hasn't grown. What has happened is the federal government has grown in its responsibilities, and then they just go, you take care of it, states. You people want local rule, go for it, right? So proxy government is just an extension of that federalism policy that we seemingly love. Now, again, there is one other controversy, though, I will point out, though. Um, the idea of it is kind of this web, uh, this very convoluted, confusing web that even bureaucrats struggle to navigate through. And your book told the story. Donald Kettle, a University of Maryland political scientist, he calls it the Mildred paradox. His mother-in-law, Mildred, in her later years, near the end of her life, she was able to successfully apply for multiple federal health insurance programs and received years worth of different types of care, all through government programs. She never actually encountered a single government worker. Um, Anytime she had to talk to someone, it was not an actual government employee, right? She qualified and got tens upon tens of thousands of dollars in medical care from all these federal programs. She never once encountered a federal employee. Um, every time she went to an office, she didn't actually go speak to a federal worker because she never actually went to a federal office, right? It's proxy government. They contracted it out to people. They subsidized it, or not subsidized, subcontracted it, Um, and when people had to give her, the medical exams or whatever, it's not like she went to a federal, healthcare clinic or something. Um, it was some sort of program where some private healthcare provider would take care of it, right? So there is that aspect to it where you can have a person who can get ungodly amounts of federal dollars without ever really encountering a federal employee. And I will say too, the problem is, and what one last problem with it, or issue too, is it can lack a flexibility or an understanding, because it's the old one size fits all. And this gets back to some of the federalism that we talked about previously. But for example, when they passed the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act of 2010, um, it basically, the whole concept of providing free or reduced breakfast and lunch during the summer. Everybody's aware of the free and reduced lunch program, which helps children whose families struggle to adequately provide for them a way for them to get decent food, at least at school, decent nutrition at school, breakfast and lunch. And then somebody pointed out, well, that's great 9 months out of the year. What happens 3 months out of the year? 3 months out of the year, the kid starves because he's not going to school and getting food. And it's not like mom and dad are magically going to be able to feed them in the summer. You can't feed them all 9 months of school. So the government, and there was some wisdom to it. They were like, all right, we're going to extend that. We're going to create a program where schools are going to have to continue to provide these meals so kids can come get these meals. Um, One of the biggest cities in this program, Philadelphia, um, it prepares about 4 million meals each summer. But the participation rate is only around 50%, because that's the other thing. They basically said, all right, you got to look up how many kids qualify. All right, you got to make a meal for each one, because you can't have a kid show up and you be like, oh, we forgot to cook for you. So the Philadelphia school system is making all these meals and only half of them are being consumed. Now, that's not a failure of the proxy government necessarily. These people are doing what they've been told by the government to do. This would be a failure of the bureaucracy lacking the ability to have the flexibility to address this complex dynamic to the situation. Um, and I don't know, you know, what the answer necessarily is. Um, but that's an example of it's not the magic, or magic bullet, right? Proxy government is not necessarily the answer to it all either. Okay, just for people who are like, yeah, let's get rid of big government, let's privatize, let's subsidize, slow down, because you still have to have rules. At the end of the day, I don't care who's doing it. It all goes back to how the rules that govern how the program is run are written. And so there are still waste, there is still failures and flaws in the system, even via proxy government. Now let's look at the evolution of America's bureaucracy. And yes, I am combining 11.1 and 11.2. Instead of having a couple of lectures, we're just going to throw it all together in one video. I hope you don't mind. Now, if you look at the original Constitution, there is really no bureaucracy in it. The departments and bureaus that we have come to know as American government were not originally written into the Constitution. The Constitution, um, it allows the president to appoint, with the consent of the Senate, ambassadors, public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, but which shall be established by law. There is never a mention of departments or bureaus. Um, of course, that was one of the first things that we did, but it's not actually in the Constitution. I mean, clearly the room is there. It says all you have to do is create it by law, and we'll do it. Um, at the very first Congress in 1789, James Madison introduced a bill to create a Department of State to help the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, do what the Secretary of State needs to be able to do. Um, he actually argued that people to be named to this department would be nominated and approved by, or nominated by the president and approved by the Senate, but they were to be removable by the president alone. That phrase started a battle. You see, Mr. Madison felt that, it was critical that these people be able to be removed or fired by the president. There was a 6-day debate in the House of Representatives after he proposed this bill. And again, it was these 6 words. The issue was, will the power of the bureaucracy rest in the hands of the president or the Senate? Um, Madison's opponents said that if the Senate has to approve someone for a position, the Senate should also have a say in whether a person is removed from that position. Mr. Madison was able to point out that if the president did not have the ability to remove an appointee, then he had no ability to basically hold sway over them. He had no control over them, if you will. And so he would basically kind of become powerless at the hands of the bureaucracy. In the end, he won the vote in the House of Representatives 29-22. When it went to the Senate, after another long debate, it was a tie, which was broken by Vice President John Adams in favor of the president. And thus, the precedent was set, and presidents are able to remove cabinet members without the consent of the Congress. But Congress still has the ability to determine funding, the ability to investigate, and well, they also basically make the law, which is kind of a critical aspect of the whole thing. So if you think that somehow the president won complete control of the government because he's able to fire his bureaucratic appointees, you're clearly forgetting that Congress has got a number of tools in its toolbox that it can use as well. Now, at first, the government of the United States was very small. Um, the State Department was only 9 employees. That's right. Jefferson and 8 other people made up the State Department when George Washington was president. The War Department did not have 80 civilians working there until 1801. The Treasury Department was really the only thing that had very much power because it was really the only thing that was doing anything in our government. And the post office was really the only service industry that the government was involved in the early days. Now, presidents have long found that appointing people to these bureaucratic positions is one of the worst things possible. It is a horrible, thankless, difficult job because the officials that you select are not just going to be, robots. They are responsible for carrying out certain tasks and duties, and the way that they view it or approach it is going to determine how they do it, right? How they view the role of government is going to determine how aggressively they pursue the responsibility of their agency or whatever. So political ideology is going to shape kind of how they will work or how they will approach the job. Um, the way that they conduct themselves will reflect upon your administration. So their character, their conduct, their tone, it's all very important. Um, they could be the most effective administrator ever, but if they are just curt and caustic and abusive to the press and just overall not a nice person, it's not going to look good on you. And so you've got to keep that in mind. Um, you do have to consider competency too. You can't go out there and get Mr. Rogers, um, nice as he is, if he has no ability to do his job. Because the last thing you want to do is appoint some nice guy who's horribly ineffective and does an awful job and makes a mess of everything that he touches. And let's not kid ourselves, party affiliation and party loyalty plays into the equation as well. And so presidents have got this delicate balancing act where they've got to try and weigh all these characteristics and traits of political appointees before they make one. John Adams remarked that every appointment creates one ingrate and 10 enemies. I like that one. Now, because Congress was the dominant power in American government um, throughout the 18th um, and throughout the 1800s and throughout the first few decades of the 20th century, um, a lot of appointments were kind of run through Congress first, right? Basically, congressional preference, as you can see up there, prevailed. What that means is um, basically congressmen, patronage. The only way that congressmen could dole out patronage was in the form of some sort of bureaucratic appointment because there weren't a whole lot of other options out there, right? You must remember, in the early days, there weren't a lot of bureaucratic positions that you could get people jobs at. There just weren't that many jobs because the government wasn't doing that much. And so you really had to pick and choose who got what, right? You had to select who was going to get rewarded for helping you win the election or being loyal to you or whatever. And so presidents took a keen eye to what congressmen wanted when it came to appointments. Matter of fact, it was this patronage that became a major reform issue. If you remember, during the Gilded Age, it led to the whole stalwarts versus the half breeds. It was part of the progressive movement, um, and there were a lot of abuses. There were a lot of abuses, but please remember that patronage did serve a purpose. Um, it basically gave the president some sort of carrot, right? It gave him a way to induce cooperation from Congress. Much like when we talked about pork at the very beginning of this course, it helps get things done. It might not be great. It's a terrible thing to say, but the corrupt patronage of, the Gilded Age did serve a political purpose. It got things done. Without it, how's the president supposed to get people in Congress to cooperate? What can he offer them, right? What is in it for them? And so that is a horrible way to put it, but it provided a reward that the president could use to get Congress to vote his way. And again, there were very few jobs early on. Now the government did begin to grow between 1816, basically between the end of the War of 1812 and the start of the Civil War. There was expansion. Number of jobs in the government grew by eightfold. But that was because of the post office. The post office accounted for 86% of the bureaucracy's growth during that, 45-year period. Um, and that's really the only agency that grew, if you think about it. And it was the only service that was really in demand. And with America growing so rapidly during that time period, expanding westward, not shockingly, we needed more postal workers. Now, the Civil War was a watershed moment in American bureaucracy. The war required hiring all sorts of people, creating new offices, creating new positions, new bureaucracy to feed the army, to train the army, to equip the army, to manage this, to oversee that as the South was conquered. You needed to create bureaus to deal with, the freedmen. You needed to have bureaus to actually deal with occupation, all that stuff, right? And the Civil War revealed that the government was in no shape to deal with some of the tasks that were being thrown in its face. Um, and it further led to a demand for reform and improvement in the quality and organization of our bureaucracy. And then if you think about it, right after the Civil War ends, what do we have? We have Reconstruction, a massive undertaking by the federal government, right? Totally outside of anything our government had ever had to do before. And that was coupled with a massive industrialization boom, which created a network of railroads that crisscrossed, across the United States, across state boundaries, creating a truly national economy. Not to mention the dramatic increase in the amount of exports and imports that were, coming into and going out of the United States of America. And all of a sudden, interstate commerce, a topic that people had not really had to deal with a whole lot up until the birth of the railroad, was now in your face. And that's something that the federal government's got to take care of. It's not a state matter. And you think about all the other aspects that came along with industrialization, urbanization. State governments were out of their league. They were overwhelmed, and these were becoming things that only the federal government would be able to tackle. And so the federal government took on a new role, the service role. Okay? From the Civil War until around the turn of the century, the government went from focusing, well, I should not say went from, the government focused very much on just trying to serve the needs of its customers, um, and the American citizens. We have all these new things that are occurring, and we wanted to provide these people with all the services that they now required. And so the American bureaucracy exploded. In this 40-year period, more than 200,000 new federal employees were added, and only half of these went to the post office. A lot of them were now working in the newly created pension office, which was going to dole out benefits to Civil War veterans. A Department of Agriculture was created. A Department of Labor was created. A Department of Commerce was organized. And again, all of these were designed to serve, not regulate. I know that when I say department of whatever, we immediately start to think of rules and regulations. But you have to think, the Department of Agriculture, when it was created, was not there to create rules about agriculture. The Department of Agriculture was created to help American farmers become more productive, to provide them with services, to provide them with education, training, um, resources. Same thing with the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor was created to help American workers, to help provide them, right? Not to create a bunch of regulations and rules on business, but to further the condition of the American worker. And again, not at the expense of business. The Department of Commerce was created to benefit American commerce. It was not created to hamper American business. And so a lot of this new bureaucracy was service related or service oriented. Um, they did research, they gathered stats, they gave all sorts of funding. They just provided people with money to do the things that they supposedly needed to be doing. It wasn't until the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, was created in 1887 that we had a federal agency that focused on regulation in the economy. Okay? 1887. That was the first federal agency created with a focus on creating and enforcing regulation, right? And when it was created, the ICC really didn't do anything. It took years before the ICC had any real effectiveness. Now, one of the reasons, well, there are several reasons why the federal government focused on a service role, okay? First of all, Americans had a strong belief in states' rights. Americans were very fearful of giving too much power to any one agency or institution or group, right? We like to have it, kind of divvied out, etc. Um, we believed in limited government. This was America's, laissez-faire golden age, right? I mean, Americans believed not in regulation, but in a laissez-faire approach where the government just kind of sat back, made sure everybody had the tools that they needed to go out and get rich or die trying. And so there wasn't a lot of emphasis on regulation. And the Constitution said nothing about giving regulatory powers to bureaucrats, right? The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce amongst the states, not some bureaucrat, not some dude in an office who didn't get elected, who just got hired to a job after he took like some civil service test, right? And so that was the other thing. Congress was a little reluctant to just kind of hand that power over because they weren't even sure if they legally could hand that power to someone else, right? Now, I mean, obviously, Congress cannot be resolving disputes between railroad companies and shipping companies and all that other good stuff, but there was the idea that really you can't just create an agency to do that either. Um, as late as 1935, the Supreme Court was opposed to those kinds of regulatory agencies, right? Some of those early New Deal programs were shot down by the Supreme Court because they felt that they had violated the separation of powers in the United States Constitution. The NRA, the National Recovery Administration, and many of its codes and rules about regulating America's economy. It was struck down. And the argument was that Congress had basically given the president regulatory powers that only belonged to Congress, that they had given it to someone who wasn't allowed to have it. So for those who might look back on this era and be like, these guys were fools, decades later, the Supreme Court was like, no, 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 you have to be careful who you hand that authority to. Um, I will point out, all the rules go out the window when it's a war, as some of you might have remembered from us discussing this class. Um, During World War I, President Wilson got away with Congress establishing prices, running the railroads, controlling food distribution, all kinds of extraordinary powers. And fun thing, some of these powers remained. Some things the government took during the war, it was not quick to give back. Um, and it wasn't just World War One. Every major war America has fought really since the Civil War, the government has found a way to increase its role, its power, its purpose, and it is loath to return it. Um, and here you go. I like how your book said this. The number of federal officials does not return to its pre-war level. Every time there's a war, there is an increase in the number of employees. Now, when the war ends, there is obviously some decrease, but it never returns to its pre-war levels. There always is some noticeable increase in the number of federal employees that permanent employees that are there after a war has ended. And something that we've talked about previously, right? You can see it's all starting to come together. You shouldn't be shocked. Once an agency is created, they don't want to disappear. They're going to find ways. They're going to find justifications. They're going to expand their argument, their role, right? They're going to figure out some way. And, you know, if you're a congressman and, this could become a way that you can curry favor with a group or, you can win some votes depending on what's going on. You're going to go ahead and fight for that organization to stay around as well. I mean, it's not going to hurt you. It's not like it's costing you anything, right? It might be costing the taxpayers, but it's not costing you individually anything extra. Your book mentioned how the reindeer service in Alaska, um, it actually increased the number of employees because they said that reindeer were a high value asset for military planning. For those of you who are wondering what the reindeer service is, the reindeer service was created by the Department of the Interior years before World War II, decades before, basically to help manage and maintain the reindeer herds for the Native Americans of Alaska. Um, and as I was saying previously, it was one of those organizations that conducted studies, surveys, just data. Basically, guys would go out in the wilderness and count reindeer and kind of track the movements of the herds and make sure everything seemed normal, right? The herds, are they shrinking dramatically? Are they making weird movements? Because the Native Americans counted on the reindeer herds, right? Um, During World War II, the reindeer service was able to somehow argue that reindeer were vital to the American war. They might be necessary for the American war effort. I don't know. I've tried to research it. I'm gonna have to take the book's word for it. I believe it. I could see that. Um, Now, the bureaucracy that you know today is the result of the Great Depression and World War II, right? There should be no shock to anyone that 80 years ago, your government went through a change that I don't know if it will ever come back from fully. You'll never be able to undo some of the institutional changes that occurred because of the New Deal and World War II. Um, these bureaucracies that were created um, changed the attitude of the American public, right? And in our view and understanding of the government and its role and its purpose, and also how we viewed the Constitution. As I said, the Supreme Court early on, and we talked about it in the judiciary just last chapter. You know, the Supreme Court was opposed to the New Deal early on, and then they flipped. Well, one judge flipped, right? There was the switch, the one judge who switched, and all of a sudden they're like, "No, no, that's cool. We can do that." And it became kind of standard for a large chunk of the American population to view that or have that interpretation. And suddenly we found ourselves with a government more focused on um, playing, as I have up here, an active role in economic and social problems. Um, a government that wanted to serve the public interest, if you will. And so all of a sudden, it wasn't just, we'll provide you with some information and funding. Good luck. Oh no, they were gonna, the government. It wasn't up to you. The government was gonna take care of it, right? The government was going to take care of the problem and take care of you in the process, right? Far cry from laissez-faire. But this is what made it possible for Richard Nixon to establish price and wage controls in 1971 to try and combat the growing threat of stagflation. Um, Heck, this is the interpretation of the Constitution, which allowed some of us to get a letter in the mail recently that we got a check from the government because of the economic hardship brought on by the COVID crisis. You know, I want you to ask yourself, what did the government do in 1930 for all those people who were out of work because of the Depression? I'll answer that for you. Nothing. Um, the government did not yet have that view, and the American public did not yet have that view of this is the role of government. Now the government sends us checks in the mail to help us get through, this tough economic time. And I've heard a handful of people kind of be like, I don't, and we discussed it a little bit. We had a conversation on our class page about it a little bit. But what's interesting is if you go back and look at that, no one in the discussion said, I don't think the government has the right to do this. What did most of us say? We were concerned about the rules, right? And who's going to get what, who's going to qualify, and what are going to be the regulations. Nobody said, I don't think the government should be sending anybody any amount of money for any reason. Nobody said that, right? Look at that, kids, right? And I know that some of you have conservative political values, but nobody is that far conservative to say, yep, no, I'm not going to do it, right? So there you go. There's a living example, a change in the attitude of the American public as to the role of government. Now, World War II is also an important one, right? I said the Great Depression, New Deal. World War II is the other one because World War II was the first time that we really, really needed the income tax. The income tax started 1913 was when it became something that the government could do, thanks to the 16th Amendment. And 17th Amendment was direct election of senators. 16th Amendment. And so it had been around for a little while, but it hadn't been used a whole lot. But World War II was the first time in which the government made a lot of use of its income taxes to pay for stuff. Because World War II, if you didn't know, was awful expensive. Um, Between 1940 and 1945, federal tax collections increased from about 5 billion to nearly 44 billion. So a nine-fold increase in 5 years in federal tax revenue. Um, and what's interesting is when the war ended, guess what? Taxes did not dramatically drop. Taxes stayed pretty much where they were when the war ended, right? Or the government was like, yeah, we got a lot of other stuff we're still having to pay for. Um, and part of it was, keeping a strong military ready for what, was going to quickly become the Cold War. Some programs that were started before the war were kept in place, etc. Um, as I mentioned, before the 16th Amendment was passed in 1913, the federal government could not collect income taxes. It used excise taxes and customs duties. Um, from 1913 to 1940, income taxes were very small. Your book had the fun stat. The average American in 1940 paid $7 in federal income tax. That's in their money. In our world, in 2018, so $7 in 1940. In 2018, $126.78. The average American paid $126.78. We'll just round it up. The average American paid $127 in federal income tax in 1940. In our money, as you can tell, that's not a lot. That is not a lot at all, right? 120. I would love to pay $127 a year in federal income tax, and that be it. I definitely pay that much in federal income tax pretty quickly, actually. But World War II really forced the government to expand a whole lot of stuff, and it gave them the justification to up the taxes, and then they never took those taxes away. Your book mentioned too a bureaucratic shift, not as dramatic as these two, but I'll go ahead and mention 9/11. 9/11 brought a shakeup in America's bureaucracy. Your book said may have affected the bureaucracy as profoundly as the Depression and World War II. I don't know if I'm going to go as profoundly, but we'll see. We'll see. It's too early to tell. I know some of you are going, it's been almost 20 years. That's not long enough to really tell if it has changed America's bureaucracy that dramatically. But what happened was we created the newest department, the Department of Homeland Security. I remember when the Department of Homeland Security was created. The DHS was going to do all sorts of stuff, and that is why within a couple of years, DHS had consolidated 22 agencies under its auspice. It had 180,000 federal employees. It was the third largest federal agency behind Defense and Veterans Affairs. It had the fourth largest federal budget. And then you think about all the other agencies that kind of come into play or work alongside Homeland Security. They are not strictly under the control of Homeland Security, but they kind of share responsibility with Homeland Security. Um, Congress in 2004 passed another law that said that eventually they would centralize um, some 70 agencies and kind of all together in one kind of counterterrorism organization. Now, all of this sounds great. Some people might be like, good, good, good. We're taking all these little groups and putting them together, and we're centralizing, and that's consolidating and avoiding people doing the same job three different ways. Turns out in 2003, DHS, the House Subcommittee on Oversight and Management Efficiency and the Government Accountability Office ranked DHS among the worst agencies when it came to management. DHS has been singled out for being incredibly not good at its job over and over again. There are a lot of issues, but the one I always like to point out is airport security. Airport security has had its problems over the years, and the great example I always like to give, they test airport security all the time. DHS basically tries to sneak stuff through and see if they can sneak it through. They have people working for them who are basically trying to get stuff through. Um, and they do a lot, a lot. So all that waiting at the airport, all those lines, all the screens, all the wands, all the taking your shoes off and do this and do that, it's not that effective, apparently. It's getting better. It has gotten a lot better because DHS got embarrassed by some of these reports. But, for a while, the airport security was a big waste of time. You had all these people asking you all these questions, and you needed a license and a this and a that, and it took forever, but it was just red tape. It wasn't really any more effective. Um, so as I said, this could be a changing moment in America's bureaucracy because it could start a trend to consolidation and centralization, right? And getting a lot of these smaller agencies under one agency. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if that's going to spread because really, outside of Homeland Security, it really hasn't taken off. Turns out the smaller agencies have done a heck of a job fighting off consolidation and integration. And also, the lack of success in DHS being effective has kind of made a lot of people pump the brakes on centralizing because what good is creating a big ineffective or like what is the benefit of one big ineffective organization instead of 10 smaller ineffective organizations? I mean, I got a better shot of actually fixing a couple of the smaller ones that might have issues. If I got this gigantic broken one, that's a harder fix. So like I said, we will see if this was another change in the history of American bureaucracy, but it's too soon to tell.